Our program at Scott Collegiate, we're a high school program that's geared towards grade 9s to 12s, and we have about 200 students or 250 students. Also, we have another program within our center, and it's called the Learning and Re-engagement Program, and that program has about 50 students. So altogether, it can be anywhere from 250 to 300 students at Scott Collegiate. So our high school program, like I said, is Scott Collegiate, and our target audience is any students from ages 14 to 18, and we have various, I guess, types of programming that run within our institute, and we have programs that are project-based. We have projects that are land-based. We have an elder in residence program where our elders are working with our youth. I should mention that we have about 97% Indigenous population in Scott Collegiate, and it might, tinker from 97 to 94. Then like it just kind of fluctuates at times, but for the most part, we serve an Indigenous population in Scott Collegiate. So with that, we have, like I said, the project-based, we try to get our students out to the land. So we have a partnership with Lumsden Beach Camp. So we're able to go out there. It's about a 20-minute drive, and we're able to access the land, the water, canoeing, in that location. We also have our Cree language program, and with that we are doing the grade 9 and grade 10 Cree language program. We have 2 teachers that have taken on the revitalization of language. We also have our elders helping with that. Being within the center, the Mama-Wet'suwet'en Center, we also have partnered with the Regina Public Library in the City of Regina, and are starting a 2-week or 12-week to be able to access that resource of 12-week revitalization. So they'll be having a Cree language instructor come, and they'll live stream it and record it, and then we're able to access the evening of Cree revitalization, but also looking at other languages as well, and then having our students engage in that and trying to involve our students of attending those as part of their class in the evenings as well, and having some assignments tied to that. We also have a partnership with First Nations University Canada, and with that partnership, we're able to go to the university and access some of their resources, but be able to take our students out in the space, and just to try to break down those barriers of our students going out and being overwhelmed on such a huge campus, and then also going out there and sometimes just doing some research in the library. And we also, this will be our 3rd year now that we've partnered with First Nations Youth to do a graduation powwow for our grade 12 students, and also inviting Treaty 4 First Nation schools to the graduation powwow. So we went from about 100 graduates being recognized our first year to 250 last year. So we're hoping to continue to build and recognize that with First Nations Youth. So those are a couple of things, or some of the things I think that our aim of our program is always and has been, is to graduate our students, increase the graduation rates, increase attendance, engage community, those types of things. I guess we measure throughout. We don't do the beginning and the end. So we kind of measure throughout. So we have an attendance team that looks at attendance every week, so that they're able to identify if there's some students, because we're on the quarter system, we want to identify them soon, like within 2 days, 3 days, that we are ensuring our students are returning or in the building. So we have a different measures. So that's one of the measures. Another measure can be, we look at our school survey data. So then we look at what our students are telling us. We're also part of a provincial initiative called Following Their Voices. And Following Their Voices enables us to sit down with our students and for them to tell us, this is how to engage us, this is what we need to be successful, and having our teachers change their practice to accommodate the students' learnings and interests, because that's a big part of the engagement piece in order for them to attain. And then the other piece would be a measurement would be credit attainment, and looking at if the students, how many percentage of the students attained their Math 10 credit that attempted it, right? So then we always are looking at that data and sharing that data with the teachers and the students. And then also science, so every required course for sure. So that would be your math, your Englishes, your sciences, and ensuring that we check on that and share that data. And then the other piece of it is if they were just below, or they were just missing a few percentages to attain that credit. And then we do the 30-day credit recovery after a quarter or a semester, as any other high school, right? Like, so that's kind of the typical way, but then we just share that data with teachers and with staff as well. I guess an example would be the commercial kitchen, a commercial cooking project. We had First Nations University of Canada professor come out and sit down and collaborate with one of our teachers, and then they shared the documentation, they shared syllabuses, and they looked at how can we incorporate the culinary arts, food as medicine, into the chemistry piece, and then just trying to collaborate that. Our land-based, I guess when we take our students out to Lumsden Beach Camp, we have connected with our elders. So sometimes it is, we've taken our grade 9s, how some will have an outdoor experience at the beginning of the year. We've also run an outdoor education program, an after school, it's kind of like an extracurricular, and they've gone out there. Many of our teachers are trained as canoe, they have their canoeing certification so that they're able to teach canoeing, but then working with elders and incorporating the science. We've done medicine picks, and sometimes they're out there for a few days, sometimes they're out there just for the day. We took our whole school medicine picking in the fall, as we've done in the past. So we collect sage, and then we distribute it to families, but then we also smudge in the building. And we use that sage for the whole year. And depending on the projects that teachers are running, they may incorporate a couple outcomes to take them out there as well. So we've had a science class and a Canadian studies class take students out there for a few days and just learn off the land and incorporate some of the outcomes, and then take the elders out there. So it is a little bit of both. We know that the land is there for us to utilize, and teachers will decide, and then again they have to put in SA1 forms to leave the city with students. But when they're ready and they can account for those outcomes, then teachers will do that individually as well. I think a big part of Indigenous education has to include the voice, the narrative of Indigenous person and peoples within Canada, and the histories and their experiences within building of Canada and North America as a whole, but also being very cognizant and very aware of bringing in Indigenous knowledge keepers and bringing in that Indigenous perspective into what we're doing. If we're looking at it from a Western perspective of English, science, math, social, and Indigenous education, how does it fit in that? It's bringing in those content pieces to supplement the Euro perspectives. So ensuring that our voices are part of those curricular areas. So from that aspect, that's kind of, we can look at that piece of Indigenous education. From an Indigenous person, I look at Indigenous education as a way of being and a way of knowing, and being able to facilitate and navigate my perspective and my belief system within a system that is not built on my belief system. And how do I interact as an Indigenous educator, knowing that if I'm struggling or if I'm advocating for Indigenous students, ensuring that our voices are included and that we are part of that conversation. So there's a couple of different ways that I interpret it. It's not just one way. But for myself personally, it's having that balance of knowing that our youth require those 12 credits to graduate, to be successful, to move on, and to be able to be citizens within the Canadian society. But with that education experience is to ensure that their experience is very different from what our experiences were coming through the system. I know that my previous experience, sometimes people will say we teach the way that we were taught, but that's not good for our students, our Indigenous students or our non-Indigenous students. So that's where we have to flip it, where we do have to ensure that those voices there's a parity, that we have Indigenous and non-Indigenous, there's that shared voice and that very like a reconciliation type tone to ensure that our voice is heard and our perspectives and our experiences are validated throughout that education system, because that's the important piece. If we continue to negate that, we're in a province that over 10 years are still supposed to be providing treaty education, and I think that's the other piece of, we have to start honoring those obligations that we have as treaty people. So I think education is ensuring that our students' voices and our Indigenous voices are included and heard, and that we're still able to get what we need to get done for the provincial government, because there's that ministry mandate for education as well, and this is what you need to have a grade 12, but also making sure that there's that inclusion. I think that's the piece as well. And not apologizing for being Indigenous. And I think that's the other piece. And challenging teachers that continue to say it makes them uncomfortable to teach treaty ed. I think that's another piece of this, is we really do have to challenge that, because there are times where I didn't feel qualified to teach, ancient civilization in Europe, but I was still required to teach it, right? I'd lose my job. So there's an obligation, and there's actually a legal, a legal obligation to teach and infuse, right, and incorporate Indigenous education into the curriculum. And when teachers aren't doing that, they're not doing what they need to, they're not doing their job. So I think that's the part of the education piece that we continue to kind of skirt around, but also just challenging it. Like as an Indigenous educator, I can't say I feel uncomfortable teaching Hamlet or, William Shakespeare. I don't have that luxury. And so I think we really need to start, looking at the supports that we need to provide that education for our students if our teachers are feeling that uncomfortable, and supporting them. My vision for Indigenous education in our community is giving our students the opportunity to decide for themselves if they want to participate in cultural opportunities. I know within a public organization, I look at, smudging. Smudging was something we started 5 years ago at Scott Collegiate, and now as a division we've adopted that practice, and I think that's really important. And it doesn't mean that we go around smudging every day. It's an opportunity, and there's space that allows for that for our Indigenous students. It's not tolerance. I don't like the word tolerance, because it just feels that, well, nobody likes to be tolerated. It's that we're being honored. So I think for education is that our ways are being honored and recognized, not a tolerance built. Like I'd like that word to disappear. And then the other piece is, again, just giving our students and our families the opportunity to say, yes, I want my child to participate in that, or no, I don't want. I feel because of the residual effects of residential school, we have a lot of work to do within education. Education played a huge role in perpetuating intergenerational trauma, whether we like to admit that or not. But as public educators and separate educators, we do have a huge obligation to try to rectify some of those stigmas, because many of our families are wanting to engage and re-engage, but again, we have to look at some of the prejudices and some of the racism that our families experience, and and validate that, because I think sometimes we overlook that experience, and just that alone can be detrimental for the rest of our students' education. So I think we really need to be cognizant of how we speak to our families and how we treat our families, but also how we provide opportunity, and giving our like I said, listening to our students and what they're telling us. This is what I need, or these are the sports I need, or this is what I know my other students that I'm friends with, they need. So having them, and then also listening to our elders. And we know that that's the structure, right? We know that mentorship. We know that that's an important piece. So as educators, this isn't anything new, but it's like actually building those positive relationships. And that's one of the key pieces for Indigenous education, because as an Indigenous student going through the system, I can tell you who my favorite teacher was, and I can tell you how many times I was taught anything Indigenous within the school experience that I had. And it was very minimal. So I feel that there does need to be that balance. There needs to be that honor. And I think that that's probably the biggest thing for Indigenous education. And underlining that is language. Education can provide that, but the other piece is, I just said this yesterday to a teacher, the language revitalization has to come from every facet, like every organization, like has to come from the community, and our families need to be involved, because we're only in school for 10 months. We might only offer a course for 2 months. Like this is a bigger issue, but it's an important issue, and it's an issue we need to do as a community. So if there's one thing for Indigenous education that we needed, it would be that revitalization of language as a whole, like every sector, if there's a possibility, because not just one, but we know that with language, it's connected to culture. And that's the piece that we know that, some of our students still need to rebuild some identity, and a strong identity. And it's there and it's waiting, but it's just to build it into what we do every day, all the time. So I think that's the other piece too. There's discrepancies across the provinces of what should be taught. Like I know as a province, it was mandated that we teach treaty education. And I believe we're one of the very few provinces that have mandated that across Canada. And I think Canada is built on treaty. It's built on those respectful relationships. That needs to be something that needs to be enforced in some capacity. Maybe not enforced, but needs to be adopted. That treaty education is taught across Canada. And I think the other piece within Canada is looking at how education, looking at the statistics too. Like if you look at as Indigenous people, we're overrepresented in all the things that are not positive, right? But when we look at education, we have the biggest learning gap of achievement. But I think we have to look at that within Canada, leaders, and really flip that, and don't apologize for reallocating resources and not waiting. Because I feel like if Indigenous education is going to move forward, there's so many other things that need to change. And part of it with education is the funding model. The funding model for provincial and federal schools, because we get a lot of students that are from federal schools, and they'll come and then they'll return back to federal. And we know that the discrepancies, even with the money that we receive as a provincial system opposed to the federal system. So for Indigenous education for Canada, and those have been recommendations brought forward right to our Prime Minister, that's nothing new by any means. Sometimes we just don't have the time. And I feel like if there was a few more opportunities to sit with our staff, to sit with our students, and with our elders, and incorporate, we do that, but sometimes it's providing that opportunity and coordinating schedules. So for me, it's not just this school that I'm speaking on behalf of. I'm speaking on behalf of all schools. Sometimes it's those resources to do that, because we know that our elders are so limited. So one of those resources would be to have elders that are able to have that time, and also to have the elders to be able to do that, because we've lost a lot of elders. Even, like, I've been involved in education for 21 years, and I've seen a lot of elders pass away. So that's probably one of the pieces for myself, of watching a lot of the elders pass away, and having that opportunity to have teachers and elders and students come together, but knowing that our elders are aging too, and they're not well. And so one of those resources would be elders, definitely, because those are our knowledge keepers, and those are the people that we take guidance from, and they have a lot of love and respect for our students. So I think the elders would be one, if we're able to, something to help achieve that vision, because the elders and the students are the ones telling us what to do. Basically, that's kind of how we try to operate. The other piece, I think it's obviously good to have resources, right? It's good to have, we would do more for the land-based education if we had resources financially. and be able to just do that without having to constantly write sponsorship letters and all those types of things to provide that opportunity. That would be kind of a nice thing. We also we had an equine horse program that we ran my first 2 years, and then we put in for a couple of sponsorships and grants to try to continue it because it's such an expensive program, but it worked. Right, our kids, it lessened their anxiety, it helped with their mental state. There was so much healing that came aside from just being in the school, right? So then they went out and they worked with horses, they built that relationship with horses, and it kept them on track, right? Because some of them were on the verge of either dropping out or potentially getting involved in some not so great choices on the street. So it helped keep them on track. But it was just very expensive for the amount of students. So that was one, obviously, when budget cuts happened, you look at, what's your overall rollout. And if you have 8 kids and it's going to cost you $3,800, well, that's the first thing that they're going to cut, right? So I think there are some programs that sometimes we need to look at. And the other piece is when we do anything cultural, it is expensive. Like, it's not cheap, and I think that's the other piece of, reconciliation. I would say it's not cheap and it's not easy. And by bringing culture and helping our students re-identify and re-engage in cultural opportunities costs money. And that's not money that we're allocated. The ministry doesn't allocate that money. Nobody gives us that money. So we have to try to be creative to get that money to provide those opportunities, to give those honorariums, to buy all the cloth, so there's that piece as well. So it's something that I know that within a public system, we don't really have a ton of money for that. But when we have a school that's 97% Indigenous and students are just so wanting to do those things, it's hard, right? It's really difficult because if you're going to do one thing, you kind of have to take another opportunity off the table, and you just kind of gauge it. And like I said, it's sometimes tricky. So money's always a good thing.